Games as a service. It's a phrase that describes a trend in the video game industry, and for many people there's a lot of negative connotations associated with it. A live service game, as I'll be calling it, is a game that employs this games as a service ideology. They're made with the sole purpose of keeping people playing for as long as possible through the addition of microtransactions and consistent content updates. There are a lot of benefits to this model, and some of my favorite games are live service games, but it's hard to deny there are some drawbacks. Premium currency, battle passes, loot boxes, cosmetics, limited time events, map packs, expansion passes, deluxe editions, all of the above. Just so many ways for these games to grab you by the balls and shake you down to your last penny. The predatory monetization doesn't even begin to describe the actual quality of some of these things. Why bother polishing up your game if you know people are going to buy whatever broken shit you throw in regardless? Fallout 76, Metal Gear Survive, No Man's Sky, all these games released half-baked and unfinished. GTA Online and Team Fortress 2 are plagued with hackers, and somebody really looked at Fortnite's Save the World and thought it was okay to release it like this. Just think about that. And possibly most damning of all, these games tend to take away development resources from non-service games, meaning they have a lasting impact for those who don't even want anything to do with it. What's that? Crash Bandicoot 4 didn't meet expectations?
I banish you to Call of Duty.
Want to know why we're never getting another Titanfall game ever again? This is why. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons to hate games as a service, and I don't blame you if you do. But like I said earlier, there are some benefits to this model. What happens if the developers of a game actually care about the product that they're making? What if the publishers respected their consumers' intelligence and wallets? Crazy thought, I know, but there do exist games like this. Chief among them is Deep Rock Galactic, a game with a hard-working, passionate dev team that makes the player's enjoyment their utmost priority. Today, I'm here to preach the good word of Deep Rock Galactic to you, humble viewer. Not only do I think it's the definitive example of games as a service done right, but it's also just a really fun game to play. It's one of my favorites to come out in the last few years. Deep Rock Galactic was developed by Ghost Ship Games and released in May of 2020 after a 2-year-long early access period. I first bought the game that following June, but I didn't really get into it until around December when my friends started to pick it back up again. After that, I was hooked, and it was pretty much the only game I played for like 4 months. This was also around the time I started taking this YouTube channel a bit more seriously, and I uploaded several Deep Rock videos around that time, back when I did gameplay highlights with my friends.
He did a little.
No. No.
Oh my god. Who's holding that trout?
Now, admittedly, I did fall off playing a bit around April and May. We started playing some other games and I started focusing on other projects for this channel, but the hype surrounding the latest update, Rival Incursion, managed to suck us right back in. This is one of the big positives of a service game like this. You can always count on there being new things to do in the game, so taking a break and coming back to it is almost like playing a brand new game again. But before I get into all the spicy new content that made me want to revisit the game, I think it's important to go over some of the basics. The core things that got me so interested in the first place. The things that make Deep Rock Galactic stand out above the rest. The basic premise of the game goes as follows. You play as a space dwarf that works for the intergalactic mining company Deep Rock Galactic, who have set up operations on the resource-rich planet Hoxes. The native life on the planet is extremely territorial and hostile, and every mission will require you to fight waves of aliens in addition to completing the primary objective. The game is a co-op PvE looter-shooter, although I use that term very lightly. You don't have to farm enemies for 60 hours for the radioactive glowing weapons that do 1% more damage over what you currently have. The looting portion comes a lot more naturally. You work for a mining company, so you mine and pillage the planet for all of its resources, and it's a natural fit for the game. Every mission, regardless of the primary objective, will contain tons of different mineral veins to mine, which all serve different purposes. For most missions, you're accompanied by a robotic mule that follows you around and collects anything you find. The mule, which is nicknamed Molly by the dwarves, has pretty questionable programming at times, and the dwarves don't hesitate to bring that up.
Just take your sweet time, old lady. I've got all day. Move your tin ass over here and hurry, please.
Deep Rock seriously need to invest in some better equipment.
You carry a load well, Molly.
But overall, she gets the job done. Gold is exchanged at the end of the mission for credits, which is the game's main currency, and is used to buy everything from cosmetic items, to weapon upgrades, to even drinks at the bar. Nitra is this red crystally looking material, and anyone can exchange 80 Nitra to call in a resupply pod, which, in addition to restoring health, is the only way that players can restock on ammo for their weapons. Unlike every other material, Nitra does not come with you once you leave a mission, so you can't stockpile a ton of Nitra to use it later, which I appreciate from a balancing standpoint. Every cave can also have 2 different crafting resources to find. Although there isn't really crafting in the game, it's more just like extra resources needed for buying certain things with credits. The caves themselves are one of the biggest draws to Deep Rock Galactic. Every cave and every mission is procedurally generated, which is a buzzword I'm sure you've heard thrown around for other games. Unlike a lot of other games that tout procedural generation, this game's caves do tend to feel pretty unique, even after playing well over 500 missions. There are a few obvious patterns you begin to notice after a while, but I'm honestly impressed with just how much variety there is in the cave generation. And even the more easily noticeable patterns tend to get mixed in with other parts in new and unique ways. The cave generation still manages to surprise me, a fairly seasoned player at this point, and that's nothing short of remarkable for a game like this. In addition to the random generation, every cave is also completely destructible. I don't think there's a single part of the terrain that can't be destroyed, even if you just go and mine in a straight line for like 20 minutes, well beyond the natural generation of the actual cave system. You can mine out tunnels, mine stairways, create bunkers, dig out mission objectives from the cliff they inexplicably landed on so you can actually do the mission on ground level. It's a super unique part of the game, and it lends itself to tons of strategizing, and more importantly, replayability. So that was the looting portion, and obviously there's also a lot of shooting. There are 4 classes to pick from, being the Gunner, Driller, Scout, and Engineer. The game breaks away from typical class-based shooter conventions of having categories of classes like offense, defense, and support, and every class has both very capable weaponry and very helpful tools to support their team. Every class comes fitted with their trusty pickaxe, a primary and secondary weapon, a mobility tool, a support tool, flares, and grenades, with upgrades to pretty much all of those things and entirely new weapons being unlockable the more you play the game. Each class fills a very different role, and if you can believe it, I think they're all balanced with each other pretty much perfectly, and there isn't really a definitive best class. Because of this, while you can do whatever team composition you want, I honestly feel that for most missions it's best to run with one of each class. The Gunner is the first class that the game lets you play during the tutorial, and he's definitely the simplest and easiest to play. Yeah, he's still my favorite though. So what if I like really big guns? As the name might imply, the Gunner is the class that excels the most at direct combat. His default weapons are the minigun as his primary, and the revolver as his secondary. The minigun is an absolute beast when it comes to single target damage, making it ideal for taking out the larger threats that other classes tend to struggle with. The revolver makes for a decent secondary weapon, and has a few niche uses for killing certain enemies at range, but for the most part it's overshadowed by the pure reliability of the minigun. The Gunner's mobility tool is the zipline launcher, which is useful for going across large pits and going down steep cliffs, but is notably limited in both its range and the angle that it can be fired at, even with upgrades. The ziplines are also pretty slow. Watching a dwarf use a zipline is like watching Grandpa go up one of those automatic staircase chair thingies. On top of all that, it's pretty easy for a ranged attacker to knock a player off a zipline and have them fall to their death. So for all of those reasons, I actually consider the ziplines to be the worst of the 4 mobility tools in the game. Thankfully, the shield generator helps make up for it, which is the Gunner's support tool. It's pretty self-explanatory. It creates a temporary shield that prevents enemies from getting inside. I don't think I need to explain why being safe from damage is a good thing, so if you can think of any situation where it's good to use, it probably is. If the Gunner is the class that's the easiest to understand, then I'd say the Driller is the hardest. It's because of that I actually used to consider the Driller to be the worst of the 4 classes when I first started out, and my friends and I usually just ran another Gunner in place of a Driller. The Driller's weapons aren't really made for taking out enemies directly, so when you first play as him, he might not feel like he's accomplishing a whole lot. But make no mistake, the Driller is one of the biggest team players you can have if you're able to adapt to the skill curve. The Driller's namesake comes from his power drills, which is not a weapon, but rather his mobility tool. They're basically like the standard pickaxe but on super steroids, which makes them great for digging tunnels, building staircases, clearing out obstacles, and being a meat grinder. The driller's actual weapons are the flamethrower, which is great for crowd control and blocking off areas with the lingering flames it leaves behind on the ground, and the pistol, which is undoubtedly the worst weapon in the entire game, and it isn't useful for much of anything. The driller also gets remote explosives, which is occasionally useful for blowing up massive holes in the ground to create little bunkers for your team to fight in, killing waves of enemies all at once, and most importantly, griefing your own team. You're the dumbest idiot I've ever had the displeasure of playing with. The Scout kind of has a reputation in the DRG community for being the mineral and light bitch, and because of that I think a lot of people perceive him as being the worst of the 4 classes. I won't argue that he is the worst class for taking out waves of small enemies, but he does a respectable amount of single target damage. And of course, he is the best class to pick for resource gathering, and for lighting up caves with his flare gun. So I like to look at the Scout as the closest thing the game has to a support role, which is a very important and overlooked role for a team to have. The Scout comes equipped with the Deep Core Assault Rifle and Double Barrel Shotgun. Both of their single target damage is fairly respectable, and the Assault Rifle in particular is fantastic at range. But yeah, neither of them are very well equipped to handle large swarms, at least not without upgrades. The Scout's true usefulness comes in the form of his support tools. The grappling gun, at first, might seem like a bit of a selfish tool that only benefits the Scout using it, but you have to remember that the Scout is the designated mineral bitch. The grappling gun has infinite uses, so the Scout can freely explore the entire cave and mine up all the nitra and other resources for the rest of the team, so they don't have to spend ammo getting into little nooks just for one mineral vein. And yeah, it's also really good for avoiding damage and kiting enemies. The Scout also comes equipped with the flare gun, which shoots out these super souped up versions of the normal flares that stick to walls and burn much brighter. You basically need the Scout if you want to actually see what you're doing in the game. The default flares just don't cut it most of the time. The last class, and certainly not least, is the Engineer. Coming from a long lineage of Team Fortress 2 Engineer ripoffs, we finally come full circle and started calling him the Engineer again. Okay, in practice he doesn't actually play anything like the TF2 NG, but it's a well-known fact that any class-based game that has a character that can build turrets is automatically a TF2 ripoff. Boo! The Engineer's Warthog shotgun doesn't really do very much damage, not as much as you'd expect from a shotgun, but I guess it makes up for it with the fast fire rate and high magazine size. I think it's pretty fun if you upgrade its range and use it kind of like a shotgun sniper at medium range. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the grenade launcher, which does high damage in a large radius but lacks ammo. The Engineer's platform gun is definitely the most interesting and versatile mobility tool in the game. It can obviously be used to place platforms to climb up cliff faces, but it can also be used to build bridges, patch up holes, and block off entry points. The fact that it can create terrain is completely unique, and can't be replicated or imitated by any other tool or weapon in the game, which all either don't affect terrain or destroy it. For that reason, I consider the platform gun to be the best mobility tool, not counting the Scout's grappling hook since that's kind of its own thing. Lastly, the Engineer has a deployable sentry turret, making him the only class capable of dealing damage indirectly with just his base kit. The actual damage of the sentry is honestly not that impressive, but again, it is a fully autonomous source of damage, so it's pretty good in situations where you can just set it and forget it. Like I said, each class is useful in their own right and there isn't really a best class, at least not without upgrades later on, and most teams should ideally have one of each class for most missions. But what if you're not into the whole co-op thing? Well, luckily for you, Deep Rock Galactic does have a single player mode. To make up for the lack of players, you're given a floating drone named Bosco, and he'll basically do whatever you tell him to do. He'll dig tunnels through these dirt patches, he'll brighten up an area, he'll fight enemies alongside you, he'll revive you if you get knocked, he'll mine whatever mineral vein you point at even if it's out of your reach. Honestly, I'm tempted to say that Bosco is actually kind of overpowered. He basically does the job of 3 other players at the command of just 1. Bosco, and solo play in general, is a pretty good supplement to the main co-op game, and sometimes I do just want to play by myself, but it's clearly not the way the game was meant to be played. While you're still experiencing the same content and using the same weapons, upgrades, and cosmetics, the sheer energy and camaraderie of playing in a group, the synergies of different classes working together, and the funny moments that happen when you play with friends, that's the main game in my eyes. So I don't know if I'd say Deep Rock is entirely worth it if you're only planning on playing it solo. It works, but you're not really getting the full experience. So that's each class with their default kit and the role they fill for their team. But each class also has 3 extra unlockable weapons that drastically change their playstyle, 2 primaries and 1 secondary. Not only that, but as you level up, you're able to add modifications to each weapon, even further increasing the amount of different playstyles, and altering the viability of some weapons and classes drastically. I'm not going to go over every mod and unlockable weapon, I'd be here all day if I did, but I do want to point out some big highlights. The gunner's first unlockable primary is the autocannon, which is a slower firing LMG weapon compared to the minigun, and has a magazine that needs to be manually reloaded, but it can be modded to shoot explosive rounds that deal massive splash damage to big groups of enemies, making it by far the best wave clearing weapon in the game. The driller gets access to the cryocannon, which freezes enemies solid rather than burning them. Freezing an enemy immobilizes them, as you might expect, but frozen enemies also take triple damage. So while it's similar to the flamethrower, in the sense that it doesn't do a ton of direct damage, it's arguably an even better crowd control tool when paired with coordinated teammates that can quickly dispatch of the frozen enemies. The driller also gets access to the experimental plasma charger, or EPC for short, to replace his useless Subata pistol. The base damage is already higher than the pistol, and it can even be charged up to do even more damage. There's also a very hard to do trick with the thin containment field mod, where you can shoot an uncharged shot into the slower moving charged shot to cause it to explode, which can be used to mine out of reach mineral veins that only a scout can normally get to. The engineer seems to get the most love in terms of mods and new weapons. Its unlockable secondary is the breach cutter, and it is insanely good. Like the grenade launcher, it doesn't have a ton of ammo, but it cleaves through groups of enemies like nothing, and it can even pass through the tough armor on bigger enemies to deal damage to their weak point without even needing to see it. Definitely a contender for one of the best weapons in the game. The sentry turret also gets some pretty unique mods. In the first tier, you're able to decide if you want to have a stronger sentry, or if you want to have two of the weaker sentries that you already have. Later on, you're then able to pick between a targeting system that does more damage at the expense of a lower visibility angle for the sentry, or if you want a targeting system that increases the range and allows for manual targeting with the ping tool. I really like all of these options, and they're all pretty balanced with each other, so each one is useful in its own right. It's nice for these weapons and tools to have lots of different mods to choose from, but there are some instances where it just really doesn't work. For instance, the platform gun. In the second tier, there's an option to buy a fall damage reduction mod, letting you place platforms at the bottom of steep cliffs as a means of getting down faster. Sounds good, right? Well, yeah, it is, but that's the only mod that you can buy on that tier. It's not like most other mods where you can pick and choose against a set of options, this is all there is. And there's no reason to not buy it either. There's no advantage to using a Mark 1 platform over the Mark 2. Also, it's kinda hard to tell the difference between the two types of platforms. They're very slightly differently colored, but you wouldn't notice it unless they were side by side, especially if you play almost exclusively with people who have the Mark II. The ping tool also highlights the difference, but that shouldn't be necessary. You really should be able to quickly tell at a glance. I think the upgrading system is obviously at its best when there are multiple options to pick from in each tier. You know, to give the player something to think about when they're building their kit. I think a good option that could compete against the Mark II fall damage platform would be bigger platforms, specifically thicker platforms. This option would make it easier to patch in holes on the ground and in the walls, while also possibly making it more annoying to scale up cliffs, and of course lacking the fall damage reduction. Maybe you could also reduce the reserve ammo? I think this would be a good alternative to the Mark II platforms. They're not super overpowered, and it would mesh well with mine and I'm sure many others' engineer playstyles. So that's quite the hefty selection of content and unlockable items right there. If this was all Deep Rock Galactic had, there would already be a ton of meat on this game's bones, and you could easily get dozens of hours out of it, playing with friends and trying to unlock everything, which is good for a service game that's designed to be endlessly replayed. But what if I told you that all of that doesn't even scratch the surface of what there is to do in Deep Rock Galactic? I mean, yeah, it's a lot of stuff, but you can see and do all of this after only putting a few hours into each of the classes. To be quite honest, it can all be a bit overwhelming, and the game is very hands-off with how it teaches the players about new concepts. Tutorials and other explanations are quite brief, and a lot of the time the game will simply ask you to try things out for yourself. Take for instance the perk system. It's probably just me, but I was pretty much unaware of the existence of perks until I was like 30 hours in. There's a computer in your bunker in the space rig that lets you unlock perks, using perk points that are unlocked by completing certain milestones in the game. With the sheer amount of things there are to do and interact with in the space rig, I can see why I got so lost originally, and how easy it could be to forget about some of these things. Whenever you have unspent perk points, the game will remind you to spend them with a small notification after completing a mission, but I don't know, maybe I just had the attention span of a walnut or something, because I didn't know what it meant by the KPI terminal. It's probably what I get for taking such a long break after only playing my first few games. I'm almost certain they explained it in some capacity at the beginning somewhere.
Finally, a chance to learn the ins and outs of this job at my own pace.
As for the perks themselves, I'm once again impressed to see that all of them are pretty balanced and useful in some capacity. Resupplier is an incredible perk to take as the gunner, as not only does it let you take ammo resupplies faster, but it also reloads all of your weapons at the same time, completely bypassing the main downside of the autocannon. On a similar note, Born Ready also opens up a nice bit of synergy with the gunner's secondary weapons. After using up all of your autocannon ammo, you can switch to your secondary and unload all of the ammo on that, and by the time you're done, your autocannon will be fully reloaded and ready to go, and you can keep this going back and forth throughout an entire wave with zero downtime. Deep Pockets is a pretty obvious one for scouts who need to grab minerals for their team. Field Medic gives you one instant revive to use during the mission, on top of revives just being faster to begin with. I like taking it as Scout, where I can get in and out of a large horde easily. I like this one, it's called Beastmaster, and it introduced me to my new best friend. No! Iron Will lets you get yourself back up after being knocked, and with temporary invincibility, but you get up with 0 health, meaning that you need to find a health source before the invincibility wears off, or else you'll just get knocked again. I mostly just use it to try and clutch out free revives when everyone else is also knocked. Even the most useless seeming meme-ass perk that they probably only added as a joke has some specific niche use. It's a bug thing, makes loot bugs automatically explode if you get within a certain range of them. You know, the harmless, passive creatures that only take a few shots to kill anyway. While I would never use it in a real game, it's honestly pretty convenient for speedrunning lower difficulty missions and getting some easy nitro and gold, even if it only saves you a couple seconds to kill each loot bug. Alright, that was a mouthful. How about we sit down for a drink for a little bit? I also want to point out that all of that content comes free with the base game, and so is everything else I'll say in the next part of the video, unless stated otherwise. A lot of it was also added via free updates. In an age where new content is oftentimes locked behind a paywall, it's so refreshing to have new content simply given to players, no questions asked. Deep Rock Galactic does have DLC packs available for purchase, but these are completely cosmetic and don't affect the gameplay experience in any way. Hell, this one is even called the Supporter Upgrade, and it's very upfront and transparent that this pack is only for dedicated fans that already love the base game and want to further support the developers. Shee, man, you know I had to do it. The DLC packs also make up a very small minority of the total amount of cosmetics in the game. Everything else can be obtained from either the cosmetic shop, seasonal holiday events, side objectives and missions, and other in-game features. There isn't even a way to easily unlock all this stuff with real money, so if you want the drip, you gotta put in the whip. Why did I write that? Alright, the space rig. It's essentially the main hub for the entire game, and it's where you'll spend your time in between missions. What I find interesting though, is that the space rig kinda takes the place of a traditional menu system, because you spawn here right as soon as you click past the title screen. Every option you need can be found by interacting with one of the many computer terminals throughout the space rig, including the cosmetic wardrobe and the weapon mod station that I mentioned earlier. Most of the progression of your overall account is covered by the assignment terminal, next to the map computer where you select your mission. Assignments basically just ask you to play a certain number of specific missions in a row in exchange for some kind of reward. This is how you unlock new weapons, certain cosmetics, higher mission difficulties, and even a few endgame specific things like class promotions and matrix cores, which we'll get into later. There are even a few little games and other doodads you can mess with, and it really goes a long way to giving this game a ton more personality. This barrel kicking game is the bane of my existence, but I love it anyway. And the jukebox is also a fun little side thing. Alright, never mind, maybe this was a mistake. Grabbing a beer with your teammates is a must between missions, and you can even tip the bartender as well. Drinking enough beer can actually get your dwarf drunk, and it's probably the most convincing drunk effect I've ever seen in a game. The drunk effect even carries over into the missions themselves, which makes the game completely unplayable, as you might imagine, but it's hilarious that it even carries over like this. Playing on the space rig is almost like playing a completely different game from the actual missions, and I'm pretty sure the developers have said that's exactly what they were going for. It's fun getting to see more of the dwarves' rude and crass personalities, and how they're in contrast with Mission Control, who's got a stick up his ass and berates the dwarves for dancing at the jukebox and kicking the barrels around.
What is this, kindergarten? You should feel ashamed of yourself.
My friends and I would always used to race laps around the ground level going a specific path, or play hide and seek, or find these weird esoteric ways to clip out of the map using barrels, and then explore the vast reaches of outer space. And we would do this for hours, not concerned about any of the missions at hand. There's even a hidden achievement for not kicking any barrels for 10 consecutive missions, and none of us knew about that achievement for months because we always just spent so much time screwing around the space rig. The only thing I feel like the space rig is missing at this point is a proper shooting range. I know the idea is to go into a real mission and have that be your shooting range, but I think it would be nice to not have to go through the same song and dance with all the loading screens and countdown timers to only adjust like a couple perks. Being able to adjust weapon builds on the fly and then try them out on like a test dummy or something, I think would go a long way in creating cool and fun builds, especially if it was able to give us in-depth damage and DPS numbers, something that's admittedly quite lacking from the mod descriptions. Oh, and poker. We need to be able to play poker on the space rig, please. Looking out of this giant window, we can see the surface of Hoxie's. It all looks really beautiful, and fortunately, the environments and the missions themselves live up to that view. You've probably noticed by now, but Deep Rock Galactic has a very unique visual style. Every single model in the game, from the terrain of the caves to the dwarves themselves, all have this low poly design to them. But just because it's low poly doesn't mean that it's bad, because there's still a ton of visual detail all throughout the game, especially in the texture work and the lighting. And it's really apparent that the style was a conscious decision to stand out and look unique, rather than a sacrifice made due to the small dev team size. It could even be both for all I know, but either way, I like the way the game looks. It's something that I very rarely think about, and you don't even really notice it when you're playing the game, but it's just one of those things where you look closer at the models and it's like, huh, oh yeah, I can see all the individual polygons on all these characters. Also, the music is just absolutely incredible. I love games with good music, and this soundtrack does not disappoint. The whole thing is inspired by 80s dark synthwave and movie soundtracks from that era, like The Thing, Prince of Darkness, basically just John Carpenter in general. It can be soothing, tense, creepy, energetic. It adds so much atmosphere to the game, and it's a great listen, even outside of that context. I'm super impressed with the sheer variety in all these caves as well, not just aesthetically, but also in terms of gameplay. There's 10 biomes in the game, all completely distinct from one another, and any mission type you pick can take place in any of these biomes. The Crystalline Caverns is the most basic biome in the game, featuring the least amount of unique environmental hazards. The whole place is filled to the brim with these massive purple crystals that aren't worth anything, but are pretty to look at and provide some interesting terrain to fight on. The only unique hazard in this biome are these blue crystals that occasionally arc electricity from one another, but other than that, this is basically your bread and butter Deep Rock Galactic biome. The radioactive exclusion zone is kind of similar to the Crystalline Caverns, given that they both have crystals, and both are mostly made up of this similar looking slate material for the cave itself, but it has a bit more going for it. The crystals in this biome are actually shards of volatile uranium, and will irradiate the dwarves if they get too close to them. The creatures that live in this biome have also adapted to the environment, so some enemies have a unique radioactive variant in place of their original form. The salt pits are also pretty basic, but I love the deep red color that makes up all the walls and ceilings. These stalactites are unstable and can be knocked down to hit enemies below them, or a fellow dwarf if you're particularly reckless. There's a unique enemy in this biome called the Coroner Youngling, but it's just a smaller and weaker version of an enemy that you can find in any biome, and that enemy is already pretty annoying to fight as is, so eh. The dense biozone is probably the closest thing we have to an underwater biome in this game. Stop asking for an underwater biome. You randomly get attacked by swarms of these jellyfish-looking creatures, and there are these massive coral formations that are actually pretty helpful for reaching higher areas without needing to use any mobility tools. I like this biome overall, but my god, every single plant is out for blood in here. From these cacti to these urchins to these bulbous exploding plants that set off chain reactions with one another, sometimes for dozens of meters. The fungus bogs is basically just a shittier version of the dense biozone. This is my least favorite biome in the game. I'm sorry to all the mushroom enthusiasts out there.
Mushroom!
I hate these vines that hang from the ceiling and block your view. This goo on the ground is so annoying to traverse over and usually requires one of the classes to use their mobility tool, and the whole place just looks like the inside of Shrek's asshole. I get that not every biome has to be appealing to look at, but that doesn't mean I gotta like playing it. The magma core is hell, both figuratively and literally. I consider this biome to be the hardest of all, since it has some of the most dangerous environmental hazards, but it's thematically fitting for the place that's closest to the planet's core. No matter what you do or where you go, streaks of magma will cover the floors and walls, making you take damage if you walk into them. This biome is pretty fun if you're in the mood to just get absolutely crushed and want very little space to work with, and it's a great feeling to be able to overcome that challenge. Although, I want to know whose idea it was to have the biome filled with fire to be the darkest and hardest to see one in the game. Like, come on now. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Glacial Strata, being a frozen wasteland made almost entirely of pure ice. This place has some of my favorite aesthetics in the game, and I just love the feeling of walking around these cold and empty corridors as the quiet dark synth music is playing in the background. Similarly to the radioactive exclusion zone, there are unique enemy variants in this biome that have adapted to the cold, meaning that cryo weapons are much less effective here. Pair that with cracks in the ground that can break open and be a serious hindrance to an unsuspecting dwarf, and random blizzards that can freeze a dwarf completely solid until they break free. This biome probably has the most amount of unique hazards, and it can also be quite dangerous. But none of that is why I like or dislike this biome. I actually really like this biome for the speedy ice! I'm tempted to say that the Sandblasted Corridor is probably my favorite biome in the entire game for one simple, probably shallow reason. It's the only biome in the game where the terrain only takes one pickaxe hit to break. Seriously, that's it. That's why I like it so much. Yeah, the sandstorms and the wind tunnels are super annoying, but it's a trade-off I'm willing to make. Couple the terrain with a fun, unique enemy that's basically a shark that burrows through the sand and kidnaps players. This biome's great, and I'm always happy to see it appear whenever I'm completing an assignment. The two newest biomes that were added in February? That was that long ago? Oh, Jesus Christ. Are the Hollow Bough and Azure
Wield.
The Hollow Bough is basically the inside of a giant tree, with all the walls and floors being made of wood, and red vines spanning all throughout. The vines twist and squirm as you hit them, and if you take down a stabber vine, you hear this awful sound in the distance. It's implied that all the plant life in this place is tied to a single sentient organism, and the Hollow Bough definitely gets my vote for the creepiest biome in the game.
It's a goose sack!
And also the funniest. The Azure
Wield,
on the other hand, is truly a sight to behold. Definitely the prettiest biome in the game, that's for sure. Despite being one of the darker biomes, it never really feels that way because of all the bioluminescent plants everywhere. This biome is also the only one to feature a unique friendly mob, being the cave angels that you can grab onto and fly around with. The visuals alone make this place one of my absolute favorites, and it also helps that there aren't really any frustrating or annoying hazards that would dampen the experience like some of the other biomes. Yeah, that's great, there's a lot of visual variety, but what is there to actually do in these biomes once you drop in for a mission? 8 things. There are 8 things. Mining expeditions are the most basic mission type, and it's also the one the game starts you off doing for the tutorial. The entire layout of the cave is basically just a straight shot with small hallways that lead into large rooms, with an exit that leads back into a small hallway, and so on. The primary objective is to look for a mineral called morkite, which is this dark teal looking material. That's it. Again, pretty simple, and it's a good way to ease new players into the mechanics of the game. Morkite missions tend to range from being the easiest in the game to being an absolutely frustrating test of patience. See, each mission has 2 modifiers that are predetermined by the game, being cave length and cave complexity. At max length and complexity, the large rooms are absolutely gargantuan. They're so big that sometimes the render distance of the game can't reach the other side of the room, and it looks like you're just staring into a black void. The problem with this is that the amount of minerals doesn't scale as the rooms get bigger, meaning that you can have like 20 times the surface area to search through in order to look for the same amount of minerals that you would get in a smaller room at a lower length and lower complexity. On top of that, higher length missions also require more morkite in order to finish, sometimes needing to go through multiple large rooms in a single mission. Needless to say, this is very annoying, and I tend to avoid long and complex morkite missions whenever possible. Egg hunts have the dwarves searching the cave for alien eggs for some kind of purpose. The game's pretty secretive about what that is exactly, but I like to think they make omelets out of them. The cave layout is much more open than the linear morkite missions, and most branching paths usually just end up leading back into the main room in some way. The eggs are found inside of these organic masses on the side of the walls, and breaking an egg out will spawn either a small group of enemies or a massive wave alerted by mission control. So it's best to break these open with a coordinated team, and not to just run around and break them open all willy-nilly. Another simple mission type, but I like it. Point extractions take place in one massive room, with a mining platform located somewhere in the middle. The main goal is to find these big blue crystals in the walls called a quark, and deposit a certain amount of them in the mine head, since Molly doesn't come with you on this mission type. After depositing all the necessary quark, the mine head will fuck off back into space, and the dwarves will need to defend themselves for 2 minutes before the drop pod arrives. These missions are probably the fastest to speedrun out of all of them, with everything taking place in one giant room, and usually being able to see all the Aquarks already visible from the minehead. This is a pretty quick and easy mission type, but it's still pretty enjoyable. Elimination missions are all about taking down a certain amount of Glyphid Dreadnoughts, the most difficult Glyphid enemies in the game. Before fighting them, they can be found in these glowing orange cocoons, and those can be broken open with very little firepower, so make sure to get your aim training in for the day before playing this mission so you don't accidentally hit it and screw over your team. There are 3 different types of Dreadnought fights: the standard original one, the Hive Guard, and the Twins. Dreadnoughts can also be fought in other mission types, with one coming in place of a normal wave, but this is extremely rare and has only happened to me a handful of times in hundreds of hours of play. These fights are pretty much all there is to these elimination missions, as there aren't really any normal swarms to speak of. Because these missions are so much more combat focused than any other, it really makes some loadouts and classes shine more than others. I feel bad for the poor sap who's forced to play non-cryo driller during an elimination mission. There isn't really a whole lot they can do that wouldn't have been better accomplished by having a second gunner, for instance. Because of that, these missions can feel a bit one-note and samey at times, with a lot less loadout variety being encouraged than other missions, since single target damage really is the only type of build worth taking here. Still a pretty fun mission type. I think the variety in boss fights and environments to fight in really help it not become too stale. Salvage operation missions are some of the most complex missions in Deep Rock Galactic. They're broken up into 3 or 4 distinct parts, and, as the name implies, involve salvaging the remains of a previous expedition, including escaping on their old abandoned drop pod. It starts off exploring a large cave filled to the brim with enemies and other hazards, in order to repair a certain amount of mini-mules, little small versions of Molly.
I am small.
Repairing them basically just amounts to finding their lost legs and reattaching them, which is made easier by downloading their coordinates from the mini-mules themselves. After that, Molly and the mini-mules, that should be a band name, are brought on board of the abandoned drop pod. And there are 2 separate defense phases that both require at least one dwarf to stay in the triangulation zone of the thing they're defending, being the drop pod's black box, and then a fuel line that mission control sends in that needs to be manually hooked up. After defending the fuel line, it's simply a matter of surviving the onslaught of enemies until the drop pod doors open. Alright, so I'm not too big on the salvage operations. For one, the initial wave of enemies in the big cave can be absurdly hard to deal with, especially if you get lots of the bigger stationary targets like the Spitball Infectors and Brood Nexuses. And new waves of enemies spawn in so frequently that sometimes it feels like there's never not any enemies. Secondly, the triangulation zone defenses are more frustrating than anything, and basically just come down to RNG at times. If even one player isn't in the triangulation zone, or is knocked or something, then the completion speed is reduced by quite a bit. Okay, sure, that's fine. But if everyone leaves the zone, then the progress bar actually begins to recede, like really fast, faster than the max progress speed. And if it reaches 0, then it instantly fails the mission. A lot of the time this isn't really that big of an issue, since you'll just be fighting waves of standard enemies with the occasional Praetorian or Acid Spitter or whatever, but there are a handful of enemies that have the ability to crowd control quite effectively, with some even being able to knock everyone out of the zone against their will, namely Oppressors, Coroner Shellbacks, and Bulk Detonators. If any of these show up, your chances of winning are thrown into jeopardy, especially if they're paired with other beefy, hard-to-kill enemies. I'm not saying it's impossible to win this mission against these enemies, but sometimes they show up and you're already so swamped by everything else and there's just simply nothing you can do about it other than to watch the progress bar go down and listen to mission control chew you out. Honestly, I think having to stay in the triangulation zone to get the progress to go up is enough of a hindrance. It really doesn't need to go down if nobody's in it. As it is right now, I think salvage operation is just too unforgiving to make it any higher than my second least favorite mission type. And as for my first least favorite mission type, hello escort duty. I don't think anybody really likes doing escort missions in games, but imagine if instead of escorting like a person or something, you had to escort a big clunky yellow piece of shit that screams at you all the time. That's escort duty. The mission is all about escorting Doretta the Drill Dozer across a massive cave system towards the Amaran Heartstone, stopping for fuel once or twice along the way, and it culminates into a massive battle against the Heartstone itself. And you have to protect Doretta the entire time, from the moment you unbox her to the moment she breaks open the Heartstone. Enemies come for her while she's moving, while she's stationary, while she's doing whatever the hell this is. You have to babysit the Drill Dozer the entire time, and it doesn't leave a ton of opportunity to do any of the side objectives while it's still active. I don't get why the dwarves love her so much. They constantly give Molly shit for being annoying and getting in the way, but at least Molly is indestructible. Doretta is supposed to be this pristine, state-of-the-art pinnacle of dwarven engineering, but the damn thing can't take more than a few hits before losing a layer of armor. I'm also not really a big fan of the Armor and Hearthstone battle itself. It's not really a battle per se, you're really just defending Doretta against more waves of enemies. But that's not the thing I take issue with. For a game that prides itself on having procedural generation and endless variation, why is the battle against the Hearthstone pretty much the exact same every time? Phase 1 and 3 are just normal swarms, with Phase 3 being a slightly larger one. Phase 2 summons floating rocks that slam down and deal massive damage to Doretta, making it an interesting balance between fighting the bugs and shooting down the rocks. Phase 4 summons these beamer crystals out of the ground that shoot lasers at Doretta, requiring them to be broken with either a pickaxe, power drill, or some other weapon that can destroy crystals from range. Phase 2 and 4 are admittedly pretty interesting and open up some cool strategies, but they're the exact same every time in the same order. The battlefield is pretty much the same every time too. Just about every other fight in the game requires the player to think about the terrain they're fighting on and how they can modify it to their advantage. This fight is just all flat, nothing to change, nothing to work with. I kind of feel bad for the driller here, he's really getting the short end of the stick for a lot of these missions. The two main things that he does best in this mission are kinda gimmicky and don't use his kit to its fullest potential. And Doretta herself is basically just a bigger, better version of the driller's power drills anyway. Overall, annoying mission type, not super fun to play, but that being said, I'll still try to rescue Doretta's head whenever I can. I'm not a monster. On-site refining, on the other hand, is my favorite mission type in the game. It's similar to point extraction in the sense that you don't get molly and there's a giant central platform, but the main objective is far more interesting. Scattered across the cave are these 3 wells of liquid morkite, and the player's job is to connect the wells to pumps that are linked back to the refinery via a pipeline. How you build the pipeline is entirely up to you. If you don't really care and are just lazy, you can crisscross them and have them zigzag all over the place, or if you care about peak efficiency, you can map out routes and dig tunnels to have each pipe be neatly organized. This is the mission type that the driller shines the most in my eyes. The world is his oyster when it comes to creating tunnels for the pipes. The dwarves can also grind on the pipes like they're Sonic the Hedgehog, and it ends up being a really great mobility tool to get the less mobile classes like the Gunner all around the map. Once the pipes are connected, it becomes a standard survival wave, with the occasional interruption to fix any leaks in the pipeline system. I really like this mission type because it's the one that best uses Deep Rock's terrain generation system to its advantage. Like every other mission, no 2 refinery missions are ever going to look the same, but because the terrain plays such a big part in how the pipeline is set up, it makes the mission much more interesting and replayable than any other. The fact that the pipeline also needs to be repaired occasionally means you can't just camp in one room like you can for most other missions, and it promotes good building management when setting up the pipeline so that it's easier to fix down the line. On-site refining highlights everything I enjoy about Deep Rock Galactic. Fantastic mission type. The most recent mission added to the game is Industrial Sabotage, and it's another fairly complicated one. The premise is that a rival mining company has a vault of important data being guarded by a legion of robots, the leader of them being the Caretaker, a massive floating upside-down pyramid. The vault and Caretaker are protected by a force field, which requires hacking 2 power stations in order to bring it down. Once the force field is down, it culminates into a boss fight against the Caretaker itself, which is the most involved, complex fight in the game. The whole thing is basically a fusion of salvage operation and escort duty, but it's far more interesting and enjoyable than either of them. Hacking the power stations requires defending a little robot named Haxie, and side note, I just love his little animations of him typing away at the keyboard. He's a certified gamer. Haxie is an infinitely better defense point than the Black Box or Doretta, because while he can be hurt, he can't ever be killed. He simply hides away if he takes too much damage and requires a reboot to continue where he left off. It's a much more forgiving system than the Black Box, and much less annoying than Doretta. I also think the Caretaker is a pretty good boss. It always spawns in a giant circular room, but the terrain on the edges of the room always varies. On top of that, the Caretaker has 4 or 5 different attacks that it can choose from for any of its 3 phases, meaning that it never gets too repetitive or samey. A massive improvement over the Armor and Hearthstone, and much more challenging to boot. After completing the primary objective, every mission will have the player call in the escape pod and start the evacuation sequence. These are some of the most tense parts of the game. Enemies will endlessly spawn, and you only get a limited amount of time to make it back before it decides to ditch your ass, meaning it's still definitely possible to fail a mission during this evacuation phase. Sometimes the escape pod will land in an ungodly spot that's nearly impossible to get to, and those are some of my most memorable moments in the entire game. Now, technically, only one person has to make it to the drop pod in order for the mission to succeed, but Come on, man, the motto of the game is leave no dwarf behind. Trying to rescue your friends after they get knocked only mere moments before making it is an adrenaline rush I don't really get with many other games, and again, just combined with that music, mwah! Every mission can also have one of 7 secondary objectives to complete. These are completely optional, but I've never met a player that didn't want to try to complete these, even if it meant dragging the mission out for another 15 minutes while you're desperately looking for that one last item. If you're able to complete it, it's basically just free XP and credits, so there's really no reason to not try to go for these. Most of these are pretty similar to each other and just involve collecting a certain amount of specific item or plant or something. The plants are usually pretty easy to see, the fossils are usually not. Gunk seeds and holomite ore are basically just freebies. Infestor fleas can be pretty annoying to kill for anyone that isn't a scout. Point extraction and on-site refining have an 8th secondary objective unique to just those missions, but it really isn't anything special, you're just looking for this blue paint on the wall. Every mission also has 2 different crafting resources to find that are dependent on the biome that the mission takes place in, with each biome having an abundant resource and a scarce resource, and there are 6 different crafting resources overall. The crafting resources do add a bit of flavor to the game, and having different resources in different biomes is a good way to influence players to do missions in all the biomes rather than just the handful that they like. On top of all that, there are a few additional random events that can spawn during a mission. Cargo crates and lost packs are the remains of old dwarven equipment, and typically contain some kind of cosmetic item in addition to some crafting materials. There are even unique bosses that can spawn, like the Korlok Tyrant Weed and Betsy, which are both high-risk, high-reward fights. The Korlok Tyrant Weed rewards the player on a macro level, by giving them an absolute metric boatload of gold and XP for depositing the Tyrant Shards that it drops. And Betsy rewards the player on a micro level, being an extremely powerful robot that fights for you for the remainder of the mission. There are also machine events, which helps transition nicely into the endgame discussion for the game. So, if the game managed to hook you with an absolute vice grip, like it did for me, then you'll be able to promote a dwarf once it reaches level 25. Promoting any single dwarf gives you access to matrix cores, which can be obtained by completing the weekly core hunt assignment, or by doing other endgame content. There are 3 types of matrix cores: cosmetics, weapon overclocks, and blanks. Cosmetics and weapon overclocks can both be forged at the space rig. Cosmetics are pretty self-explanatory, but overclocks are where the real fun begins. Every weapon has one special overclock slot that can be used once every other mod slot is unlocked, and they give your weapons further boosts beyond what the standard mods give. Some of them are pretty basic, like just giving you more damage or more ammo. Some of them give bigger boosts in exchange for more drastic downsides, and others completely change the weapon and make it feel like you're playing with an entirely different gun. Again, I won't dwell on overclocks for too long. I could sit here all day and talk about all the super fun overclocks that I love playing with, but I'll just mention some brief highlights. Neurotoxin payload for the autocannon. Oh my god, it is so insanely good. Shooting a creature has a chance to infect them with a deadly neurotoxin, which damages them over time. And for most enemies in the game, the neurotoxin does enough damage by itself to kill them from full health. Honestly, the biggest downside to it is trying to get your teammates to not waste their ammo on infected enemies. Big Bertha is also a great one. It turns the autocannon, a primarily wave-clearing focused weapon, into a jack-of-all-trades AoE and single target damage machine. My absolute favorite overclock in the whole game has to be Special Powder for the Scout Shotgun. It's basically the Force of Nature from TF2, but with way more knockback. It's not only super fun to fly around the whole cave, but it's also insanely clutch to be able to maneuver around the map while you're waiting for the grappling hook to recharge, or to just fly to places that the grapple couldn't even reach in the first place. The Scout also gets AI Stability Engine, which basically removes all bloom and recoil from the assault rifle, and turns it into an absolute laser gun. So if you have decent aim, there's basically no downside. Lately, I've also been really enjoying cryo minelets on the Scout's Zukov SMGs. Again, cryo is insanely good, free triple damage on just about any enemy in the game, and especially paired with cryo grenades and the cryo cannon. The engineer is absolutely spoiled for choice when it comes to overclocks. There definitely seems to be a bit of favoritism going on here. Magnetic pellet alignment on the shotgun endorses that mid-range playstyle I enjoy with that weapon. Turret EM discharge on the SMG makes turrets do pretty decent area damage if enemies walk near them. Fatboy and Hyper Propellant are both extremely fun and might as well be completely different weapons with how different they are from the standard grenade launcher. And Return to Sender, Spinning Death, and Inferno are all basically just free extra damage for the Breach Cutter, a gun that already does an insane amount of damage to begin with. The sheer amount of variety and viability of all these overclocks turned the engineer from a fairly mediocre damage dealer into probably the single best class in the entire game. There's pretty much nothing he can't do. It's insane. Earlier I did say there was a third type of matrix core, being blank matrix cores. These can be exchanged for either a cosmetic or overclock core at a machine event, which randomly spawn during missions. Machine events can be started by any player who has at least one class promoted, and there's a few different kinds of them, but they all revolve around doing some kind of objective involving the machine itself. The cool thing about machine events is that the XP and gold that they give still make them worth doing even if you don't have any blank cores, or if you're playing with a new player who doesn't have any promotions. Unless it's the Omen Tower, then it can go fuck itself. Overclocks and machine events aren't the only thing that promotions give, as they also unlock deep dives, a unique game mode for endgame players. Simply put, deep dives are basically just 3 missions back to back, with each stage getting harder than the last. Your health and ammo persist between each stage, but so does your nitra supply, meaning that you can hoard nitra in earlier stages to have a surplus at the end when you fight the more difficult enemies. Deep dive stages also don't have a normal secondary objective, instead they have 2 primary objectives, and they both need to be completed in order to move on. The terrain generation and mission objectives on deep dives are the same every single time for everyone who plays them, resetting once a week every Thursday. Each individual stage of a deep dive rewards the player with a matrix core once a week, regardless if they manage to fully complete the entire deep dive or not. There's also 2 different types of deep dives, being the normal one and the elite deep dive. Elites are basically the same rule set, but with different terrain generation, a higher difficulty level, and they give their own set of matrix cores. In order to play a deep dive, the class being played must have been promoted at least once, which also holds true for elite deep dives, which I think is kind of a mistake. I think the level limit should be higher on those. I don't think one promotion is enough experience with the class to really be able to pull their weight in an elite deep dive. Each class can be promoted more than once, but any promotion after the first one is purely cosmetic. Being able to level up each class after each promotion lets your overall player rank get higher, which unlocks more assignments for more cosmetic items. Plus the higher level borders just look cool, and service games are all about getting the highest number possible, so there you go, that's the endgame content. So that's basically the core of Deep Rock Galactic's content. I know it was a lot to get through, and it was getting pretty jargony at points, but my point in going over all of it is to show that there is a lot to do in this game. And pretty much all of it is fun, engaging, and consumer friendly once you're able to wrap your hand around all of it. I'm going to reiterate, other than the cosmetic DLC packs I mentioned earlier, everything I talked about comes with the base game at no additional cost, and is not limited or exclusive to stupid ass one-time events or anything. A lot of service games kind of have a stigma against players that don't buy cosmetics because they look default or whatever, which is probably the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. But in Deep Rock, even that's not a problem, because most of the cool cosmetics are unlockable in the base game after putting in enough hours, which is a lot more fun, and a lot more rewarding and incentivizing to continue playing. Deep Rock Galactic's most recent update goes by the name of Rival Incursion, and is the introduction to their new seasonal model, featuring a battle pass and daily login challenges. Immediately, this may raise a few red flags, but once again, their actual implementation of the system is very consumer friendly, and shows that there are a ton of benefits to the service game model. A rival mining company of robots has set up operations on Hoxies, and it's up to the dwarves to fight back against the robots and to steal any important data they might have collected on the planet. My friends and I always used to talk about how cool it would be to fight back against a rival mining company, and it's awesome to see that idea fully come to fruition, even though we really had nothing to do with it. A lot of other games also do this quite well, but having themed seasons is a good way to keep the player base engaged, and it gives them something to look forward to when the next season rolls around. The Battle Pass is completely free, and tiers are unlocked by simply gaining performance points, or PP, with no way to buy tiers or to fast track your way to tier 100, which I appreciate. The main way to get performance points is by completing missions, but there are also 2 side objectives within the missions themselves that grant bonus points. Missions can have either a prospector data deposit, which is just the same hacking defense wave as the industrial sabotage mission, or a prospector drone, which is a big flying boss robot that sends out waves of smaller robots. There are also now daily challenges for even more performance points, and it's just pretty basic stuff like complete 3 egg hunts or complete 5 missions as a driller, for instance. Each tier of the Battle Pass gives either a cosmetic item, crafting minerals, credits, or a new type of currency called scripts, which can be used to buy items from the Battle Pass's cosmetic tree. It's kind of weird for a Battle Pass to have 2 different layers of progression like this at the same time. I've really never seen any other game do a system like this, but at the same time it's kind of unique and interesting. It gives this game its own flavor. Part of the reason the developers wanted to add a battle pass is because they wanted a separate layer of progression to unlock new items that's equally difficult for both newcomers and veterans to the games alike, and I respect that decision. The item store, lost packs, cargo crates, and matrix cores all already have so much to collect in them. Adding more stuff to that item pool doesn't really do anyone any favors, and it doesn't really get anyone excited. The feeling of having something to work towards is great, and to have it all be fairly attainable no matter how many resources you've stockpiled previously, I think it's a good way of showing who the most dedicated players are right now, as opposed to who just played the most in general. The best part about all of that is that none of these items are exclusive or limited time, as they'll all be added back into the game in some capacity after the season ends. The way that'll be done isn't set in stone as of yet, but to me it just shows that Ghost Ship Games have the player's best interests as their utmost priority. Deep Rock Galactic is one of the most impressive co-op shooters I've ever played. Every aspect of the game seems like it's setting itself up for failure when looking at it from the outside. A Minecraft-inspired procedurally generated indie game that released into early access actually turned out not only to be good, but one of the best of its kind, and it feels so weird to be able to say that and have it be true. When looking into Ghost Ship Games, it's obvious to see why this is the case. They interact with their community, they listen to feedback and make adjustments accordingly, and their top priority is simply to make a fun game that a lot of people will enjoy. And they'll continue to support it as long as people continue to play it, which I don't think will be a problem anytime soon. Ghost Ship Games proves to me that service games can be built without compromise, without purposely hindering the player experience just to get them to spend more money. Deep Rock Galactic is dark, whimsical, tense, hilarious, and an absolute joy to play. The art style is very unique, the soundtrack is a treat, the dwarves themselves are oozing with style and personality, and the actual gameplay is so mechanically deep and has so much variety that I never get bored playing it, even 300 hours in. It's fun to upgrade weapons, it's fun to unlock cosmetics, it's fun to just play the game. Despite the sheer amount of things to see and do, the grind to unlock everything I possibly can doesn't even feel tedious. It just gives me more of an opportunity to spend time in a world that I enjoy. And to know that there will always be more updates on the horizon, and those updates are made by a hard-working team that loves the game as much as we do, and wants to see it get even better, it just gets me excited to continue playing the game, and to know I'll enjoy it for years to come. Rock and Stone.